Lawyers, what's the smartest clause you've ever seen hidden in a prenup? Story 1. I represented a woman who was about to marry a wildly successful tech entrepreneur. She had her own career and money, but the groom's side insisted on a prenup. She didn't mind, until she saw what her own lawyer added in response. It was a clause that stipulated if the husband ever engaged in infidelity, even emotional, she would receive a lump sum payout equal to 50% of his annual income for the year it occurred, on top of what was already agreed in the split. What made it clever? The definition of infidelity was detailed and included sexting, dating apps, and even repeated dinners with a specific person outside family or business. It also allowed private investigators' findings to qualify as admissible evidence for triggering the clause. The groom agreed, probably thinking it was just symbolic. 10 years later, during a very messy divorce, it turned out he had been maintaining an affair for 3 years. The clause kicked in like a financial landmine. She walked away with several million more than she would have otherwise. I have never seen a client so grateful for a lawyer's foresight. Story 2. A prenup I once reviewed had this brilliant clause. If either spouse gained more than 20 pounds over their wedding day weight without a documented medical reason, they would forfeit a portion of their claim to shared assets in the event of divorce. It sounded petty at first, and I was sure it wouldn't hold up. But the way it was written wasn't about vanity. It was framed around commitment to health and mutual lifestyle goals. There were built-in exceptions for pregnancy, thyroid disorders, and mental health conditions. The idea was that both parties had agreed to keep fitness a priority, as it was a core part of how they met and bonded, marathon running. It was clear the clause wasn't about body shaming. It was a form of mutual accountability. They're still married 5 years later, and the clause has apparently become a running joke between them. I found out through a mutual friend that they even weigh in together on their anniversary as part of their ritual. Weird, but hey, it worked for them. Story 3. I was a junior associate working on a prenup for a couple. She was a novelist. He was a startup founder. Her lawyer inserted a clause that said if the husband ever started a business that used any creative content or ideas inspired by her stories or characters, she would automatically own 25% of the business. At first glance, it seemed ridiculous. But she had a reputation for crafting unique sci-fi plots, and sure enough, 5 years later he launched a VR company that mirrored the dystopian world she'd created in one of her books. She sued to trigger the clause. His defense team argued the idea wasn't copied, but the clause didn't require proof of intent, just substantial similarity. It settled fast. She got equity, royalties, and board input. Without that clause, she would have had no grounds. Genius move by her attorney. Story 4. There was this ultra-rich couple where the husband's side insisted on a clause protecting his rare wine collection. Sounds silly, right? But his lawyer included a specific line in the prenup saying that any depreciation in the collection due to improper storage, tampering, or consumption without consent would be considered financial harm, subject to reimbursement from the joint estate. Cut to 5 years later. She threw a massive party while he was abroad, and dozens of bottles were opened and served, including some vintage ones worth tens of thousands each. He filed for divorce shortly after, citing irreconcilable differences, and used that clause to demand $300K in restitution from what would have been her share. It was cold, calculating, and brilliant. She had no defense. I remember thinking, this is the first time I've seen a divorce fight over wine, and one party actually wins because of it. Story 5. A clause that still gives me chills was one crafted by a woman marrying into a powerful family with ties to politics and oil money. Her lawyer inserted a sunlight clause, stating that in the event of a divorce, any attempts by her spouse or his family to pressure her into silence about anything from abuse to family secrets would nullify every other clause in the prenup. And here's the genius. If triggered, the clause would allow her to publish a memoir or documentary without legal obstruction, and she'd receive full spousal support as if the prenup didn't exist at all. The clause even protected her from defamation countersuits. The family tried to fight it during their eventual split, especially after she announced a book deal. But the clause was airtight. She got everything. The book? A bestseller that took down 2 political careers. That lawyer didn't just write a prenup. She wrote a loaded gun and handed it to her client, just in case. And she used it. Story 6. I once drafted a prenup for a woman marrying a famous chef who owned multiple restaurants. Her lawyer requested a clause that sounded odd at first: right of recipe attribution. Essentially, if her husband ever published a cookbook, opened a new restaurant, or created a dish inspired by meals she had personally made or developed, she would be legally credited and compensated. Turns out, she had been quietly helping him craft menu items, playing the behind-the-scenes muse for years. She wasn't even a professional chef, but some of his best-selling dishes were spins on meals she cooked at home. The clause valued her creative input. Years later, after their divorce, he tried to release a cookbook featuring several of those dishes, without crediting her. She sued. The clause held up, and she received royalties, acknowledgement in the published book, and a co-writer credit. Without it, she would have disappeared from the narrative entirely. Story 7. This couple met while traveling and bonded over their love for adventure. They included a wild clause in their prenup. If either party refused to go on at least one international trip per year for 3 consecutive years without a valid reason, illness, emergency, finances, it would trigger a renegotiation of spousal support in the event of a divorce. It wasn't about forcing travel. It was about protecting their shared lifestyle and preventing complacency. Travel was their love language, and they wanted to ensure they never stopped exploring. Unfortunately, 10 years in, the husband became a total homebody. No trips, no enthusiasm, no compromise. They eventually divorced, and she leveraged the clause to receive more support than she would have otherwise. The judge ruled that failing to honor a mutually agreed-upon core lifestyle value counted as grounds for modifying financial terms. Creative, specific, and effective. Story 8. A high-profile actor and his much younger partner were preparing to marry. His legal team insisted on a clause that said if she ever posted intimate photos, personal texts, or private recordings of him online, or shared them with the press, even after divorce, she would not only forfeit all spousal support, but would owe him a punitive sum of $500,000. We thought it was just about reputation control, which is common in Hollywood. But the kicker? He made the clause retroactive, covering anything that occurred during their dating period, too. Turns out she had a burner Instagram, where she had been posting blind items and photos hinting at their relationship months before going public. Once they broke up and she tried to go public with her side of the story, his team hit her with the prenup clause and a cease and desist. She shut everything down, and he never paid a cent. That clause didn't just protect his finances, it nuked her entire media strategy. Story 9. A wealthy heiress marrying a self-made tech CEO had a clause added that stated if either spouse knowingly invested marital assets into a venture involving family or friends without written approval from the other, that investment would be considered a personal debt, fully repayable to the joint estate. Her concern? Nepotism. She had seen family members lose millions because spouses funneled money into their siblings' doomed businesses. This clause basically made that impossible without mutual agreement. Sure enough, the husband invested $600K into his brother's failing app idea without telling her. It flopped. She found out during tax season and triggered the clause. He had to repay that amount back into their joint holdings before the divorce was even finalized. Brilliant, because it turned an emotional betrayal into a clear-cut financial liability. Story 10. Probably the most elegant clause I ever saw was what I call the legacy clause. A couple, both artists, agreed that if they ever divorced, any artistic work created during the marriage would be considered shared intellectual property, regardless of individual authorship. This included paintings, screenplays, songs, even unpublished drafts. They even had a joint copyright lawyer review the catalog annually to confirm what was considered marital. 15 years later, they divorced amicably. But a screenplay she wrote during their marriage got picked up by a major studio. Thanks to the clause, he retained 30% of the royalties, despite not writing a word of it. However, a painting he made now hangs in her gallery and continues to make them both money. They say it was the clause that kept their divorce civil, because it forced them to view their creations not as personal legacies, but as mutual ones. Story 11. One prenup I worked on involved a couple who met working in the same architectural firm. They were both fiercely competitive, but also deeply in love. Her lawyer added a clause that came to be known in our office as the credit clause. It stipulated that any collaborative project completed during the marriage in which both spouses participated, either formally or informally, had to be credited publicly by name if the work was submitted for awards, grants, or public display. No exceptions. The husband agreed, probably assuming they'd never work on projects together officially. But as the years went on, they co-designed some incredible structures, especially during long nights at home, brainstorming over wine. One of them ended up becoming a major civic landmark in their city, and when the husband accepted a national award for it without acknowledging her contribution, she filed a claim. Turns out she had emails, sketches, and voice recordings proving her conceptual input. The prenup clause forced the award body to revise the citation and include her name retroactively. Not only did she receive recognition, but it also gave her career a massive boost. Story 12. A groom's attorney once insisted on what he called a zero inheritance leakage clause. It stipulated that if his future wife ever used marital funds, gifts, or shared credit to pay down debts incurred by her extended family members, those expenses would be deducted from her eventual divorce settlement dollar for dollar. His concern was her enabling behavior. Her parents had a long history of financial chaos, and she'd once emptied her savings to cover her brother's gambling debt. The clause wasn't cruel, it was preventative. She agreed to it after some negotiation. Flash forward 7 years. Her cousin started a small business and she secretly gave him a $50K loan from their joint account. She didn't see it as a betrayal, but when divorce hit a year later, that amount was subtracted directly from her asset split. The clause was so precise that there was no room for argument. Paper trail, bank statements, boom, penalty applied. It was harsh, but her ex had protected himself exactly as he intended. Story 13. A couple in their late 50s, both on their second marriages, had this fascinating clause that I dubbed the rewind clause. It stated that if either spouse initiated a divorce before their 10th anniversary, all joint property purchased after the wedding would be divided in proportion to their individual financial contributions, not 50-50ths. They wanted to prevent quick splits motivated by lifestyle upgrades. Think of it as a loyalty test clause. 9 years into their marriage, the wife filed for divorce. She had contributed about 15% of the funds used to purchase their vacation home, cars, and investments. Normally, she'd walk away with half under local law, but the clause kicked in, and she only got back what she actually paid in. She tried to fight it by arguing the clause was punitive. It wasn't. It had a clear expiration, 10 years, and she had signed with full counsel. It held up, and her ex saved over $1.2 million in asset protection. One of the cleanest, smartest defenses I've ever seen in a prenup. Story 14. This couple owned several pets together before they got married, 3 dogs and a cat. The prenup included an unusually detailed pet custody clause. It divided custody, care, and even decision-making about euthanasia or surgery in case of medical emergencies. It also assigned visitation schedules, expenses, and who got each animal in the event of a split. Most would have laughed at that clause. But when they divorced 5 years later, the clause became the most important document in the entire case. They didn't have kids. The pets were their kids. Without that clause, it would have turned into a brutal emotional war. But since everything was predefined, right down to who pays for vet insurance and where the pets spend Christmas, it was peaceful. They stuck to the agreement to the letter. The wife later told me it was the one thing that preserved their friendship. Ironically, they still meet for dog park days, just like it says in the schedule. Story 15. A groom had just sold his 3rd startup for tens of millions and was deeply paranoid about intellectual property theft. His lawyer added a clause that said if the bride or any of her relatives attempted to patent, trademark, or register any concept, name, or technology idea discussed within their home during the marriage, the groom would retain full rights and receive injunctive relief plus damages. It seemed insane at first. Who was going to steal ideas from Pillow Talk? But believe it or not, it happened. The bride's brother, an aspiring app developer, quietly filed a patent application using a concept the groom had once drunkenly rambled about at dinner. It even used the same name. The groom found out through an industry contact. He filed for divorce the next day and activated the clause. The brother was forced to abandon the patent, and the groom received a court-ordered NDA from the entire family regarding future use of anything discussed during the marriage. Extreme? Maybe, but if you live in the world of venture capital, it's survival. Story 16. A client of mine was a mechanical engineer who developed a series of energy-efficient turbine designs. Before getting married, his fiance's legal team insisted he agree to a prenup clause that, on the surface, looked generous. If he ever earned over $1 million in a single fiscal year, she'd receive a success bonus of $250,000. He was fine with it because he wasn't anywhere near that figure yet. But here's where her lawyer got clever. The clause also stated that the threshold would drop to $750,000 if any of his patents were sold or licensed, and retroactively applied if he hit that mark within 24 months of marriage. Turns out, 6 months after they tied the knot, he sold a portion of his IP portfolio to a German firm for $5 million. The moment it closed, she triggered the clause. There was no hiding money or maneuvering around it. Everything was documented. She collected the bonus, invested it wisely, and 3 years later, when they split amicably, she already had a fortune of her own. He said later that he never resented her for it because she played by the rules and she played smart. Story 17. This woman was marrying a retired NFL player. They'd known each other for a few years, and while she wasn't wealthy, she had built a small yoga brand with a few studios and a cult following on Instagram. Her lawyer inserted a clause that basically functioned as a brand growth shield. If her brand experienced exponential growth, defined as a 300% revenue increase within 5 years of marriage, he couldn't claim spousal interest or partial ownership unless he'd contributed direct labor or investment. At first, everyone assumed it was just legal fluff. But after they married, she started gaining major traction on social media. A celebrity endorsement, then a fitness apparel deal, and suddenly her company was making 7 figures annually. When divorce came unexpectedly 4 years later, he tried to argue that his fame helped boost her visibility, therefore making him a factor in her business success. The clause killed that argument instantly. She kept her company 100% intact. Her lawyer had essentially built a legal firewall around her potential before it even ignited. Genius. Story 18. One of the more bittersweet cases I've seen involved a woman who had been the primary caregiver for her autistic younger brother since she was 20. When she got engaged to a wealthy doctor, her lawyer wrote in a clause that if she ever had to resume full custody of her brother during the marriage, the husband would either have to financially support her reduced work hours or agree to in-home professional care costs as part of marital expenses. It was oddly specific, but it mattered to her. 6 years into the marriage, her brother's group home closed unexpectedly due to funding cuts, and she had no choice but to bring him to live with them. The husband initially agreed, then slowly began pushing back. "Can't your mom help? Can't we send him somewhere else?" She reminded him of the clause. He refused to comply. She filed for divorce. That clause gave her legal ground to demand financial assistance for full-time caregiving post-divorce. He tried to say the situation wasn't permanent, but her team had records, emails, and dates. She won custody of her brother and was awarded alimony specifically tied to the clause. Not every prenup is about betrayal. Sometimes they're about protecting your responsibilities. Story 19. There was a groom who'd come into an enormous inheritance from a family trust. But the kicker was, the trust couldn't be accessed directly. Instead, he had to hit specific milestones to receive scheduled payouts: college degree, marriage, child, etc. His prenup included a clause that said if his spouse ever publicly disclosed the structure, rules, or total amount of his family trust, she would automatically lose all claims to spousal support or asset division in a divorce. He was secretive about money. She was a lifestyle influencer. After their split, triggered ironically by her growing frustration that he wouldn't go big with spending, she went on a podcast and vaguely mentioned his weird money situation, hinting at the inheritance. His legal team pounced. Because of the clause, she forfeited nearly everything. She couldn't even fight it in court because the prenup had a binding arbitration clause tied specifically to the financial privacy provision, one of the most airtight, brutal financial safeguards I've ever seen deployed. And it worked. Story 20. This story still blows my mind. A couple in the entertainment industry, he was a movie producer, she was an aspiring screenwriter, had what I call the shadow work clause. It stated that if either spouse provided uncredited writing, editing, or consulting services on a project that became financially successful, defined by box office returns or licensing deals, they'd be entitled to 15% of the net revenue derived from that success, even if their name wasn't publicly attached. She had helped him develop scripts for years. After marriage, she started doing even more, editing drafts, fixing character arcs, building dialogue. When they divorced, she compiled emails, script drafts, even recorded Zoom sessions showing her involvement in 3 major projects. One had made over $60 million worldwide. The clause held up. She didn't get writing credits, but she got a payout in the 7 figures. It taught me that sometimes the smartest clause isn't about what you own. It's about making sure your invisible labor is valued. That clause gave her credit where the industry never would. Story 21. I once represented a man who had spent 12 years building an eco-conscious clothing brand from scratch. His fiancée worked in fashion too, but more on the influencer side. Her attorney requested a clause that I thought was absurd at first. If he ever altered the company's ethical sourcing practices or began using synthetic or non-eco-friendly materials, she'd receive a buyout clause, as if she was a shareholder being forced out. It had nothing to do with ownership. The idea was that if he ever betrayed the brand's values, she could claim a payout equal to 10% of the company's current valuation. 3 years into the marriage, he took a massive investment offer that included manufacturing in Southeast Asia with questionable labor conditions. She confronted him, and when he refused to reconsider, she filed for divorce and triggered the clause. Her payout? $2.40 million, calculated based on an independent audit of the company's worth. His own team couldn't contest it. It wasn't about money for her, it was a philosophical red line, and her lawyer had given her a financial tool to make sure that line mattered. Story 22. A couple was entering their second marriage. Both had kids from previous relationships. The bride's lawyer added a no parent left behind clause that said if the marriage ended due to infidelity or abandonment and the offending party remarried within 2 years, the other spouse's children would be entitled to tuition support until age 21 from the offending spouse, just as if they were biological children. It sounded overly sentimental, but the clause was built tight. 4 years later, the husband left her for someone else and was married again within 13 months. Her teenage daughter was starting college, and the clause allowed them to file a civil motion that enforced partial tuition payments from the husband, even though he was no longer a legal guardian. The judge upheld it, stating the agreement was voluntarily signed and met contract standards. His new wife was livid, but it was airtight. I've seen a lot of revenge clauses, but that one was elegant. It didn't punish, it protected. Story 23. One of my clients, a software developer, was extremely socially awkward but brilliant. He'd developed a dating app that exploded in popularity. Ironic, considering he'd met his fiancée at a networking event he barely wanted to attend. When it came time to draft a prenup, he had only one request. Any proceeds from future algorithms or features related to user psychology, engagement prediction, or dating behavior analytics would be considered separate intellectual property. Why was that notable? Because his fiancée happened to be a PhD candidate studying behavioral psychology. She'd contributed many casual insights during their relationship that ended up shaping how he developed retention strategies. The clause essentially protected him from her claiming later that their late-night talks and her fieldwork had given him a leg up. When they divorced, she brought up the app's new success and hinted at consulting credits. He calmly cited the clause. She backed off immediately. It wasn't cold. It was protective. Sometimes, what looks like paranoia is just experience in disguise. Story 24. I once handled a prenup for a couple who ran a boutique travel agency together. The clause that stunned me was one I call the vanishing client list clause. It said, if they ever divorced, neither party could solicit clients from their joint business or work with any of the agency's top 25 clients for at least 24 months post-divorce. It wasn't just a non-compete. It was designed like a firewall. When the marriage collapsed, the wife tried to start her own agency immediately. But the clause was so exact, it had a ranked list of their top clients by revenue, complete with names and renewal timelines. If even one of those clients migrated, she'd owe him a percentage of gross profit. She consulted another attorney, hoping to find a loophole. There wasn't one. She had to launch with an entirely new base. Harsh, yes. But both had built that client book together, and he didn't want to wake up watching it disappear just because the marriage did. Story 25. This was one of the quietest but most genius clauses I've seen. The bride was an artist. Sculpture, installation work, all pretty niche. Her prenup included a clause that stated if any of her artwork was resold at a profit exceeding $10,000, she would be entitled to 50% of the resale profit, even post-divorce. It wasn't about spousal support, it was about art flipping. Her husband was a finance guy and loved collecting her work. He bought several pieces during the marriage and, unknown to her, began reselling them privately to his collector friends. After they separated, he sold one of her early works at auction for over $100,000. She found out when a gallery posted about it. Thanks to the clause, she was able to retroactively claim half of the profit from that sale and others he had made. Her lawyer had even required that each piece sold be registered in a document log to track resale events. She told me, "He saw me as an investment. My lawyer made sure I got a cut when that investment paid off." Story 26. A high-level fashion executive I worked with had a prenup clause that only made sense after the divorce. It was called the Holiday Licensing Clause and stated that if her spouse ever used her image, name, or likeness in any commercial campaign, directly or indirectly without her written consent, he would owe her 100% of the campaign's profits. Her fiancé at the time was a marketing genius in the luxury retail world. She suspected that once they were married, he might use her image for soft branding, especially in his overseas ventures where she had modeling recognition. Lo and behold, 4 years into marriage, she discovered that a new line of perfume in Dubai had used AI-generated images strikingly similar to old modeling photos of her, with a fictional name that was just one letter off hers. She kept receipts. The company was a shell brand under one of his subsidiaries. Thanks to the clause, she was awarded every penny the campaign had earned, nearly $2.1 million, and the brand had to retract the entire rollout. It wasn't about ego. It was about owning her identity, even when someone tried to blur the lines. Story 27. I had a client, an up-and-coming video game designer who was marrying a lawyer. She was protective of her time, her projects, and her peace, so she requested a clause called the Launch Window Clause. It stated that for any period 90 days prior to or 60 days following the launch of one of her games, her spouse could not file for divorce, separation, or begin mediation proceedings unless infidelity or abuse was proven. It sounded bizarre, but to her, launches were like childbirth, high stakes, emotionally taxing, and financially pivotal. Sure enough, during the final stretch of one of her biggest launches, the husband began threatening divorce. He thought it would rattle her into giving up a larger share of future royalties. She calmly pointed to the clause and said, "You can try, but it won't go anywhere right now." He backed off. The game was a success. When they did split later, she had the financial footing and mental clarity to fight on level ground. Story 28. A man who owned a chain of high-end coffee shops had an unusual fear that his future wife, a talented baker, would someday open a competing business after divorce using his recipes and supplier contacts. The clause they added was dubbed the Ingredient Trail Clause. It said that if either party started a competing food or beverage business within 5 years post-divorce, they'd have to submit all ingredient lists, supplier invoices, and menu drafts to a neutral arbitrator to ensure no proprietary overlap. Sound intense? It was, but it saved his business. 2 years after their divorce, she launched a bakery across town. A coffee cake on the menu raised flags. He filed for arbitration. It turned out she'd been sourcing from his exclusive cocoa supplier and mimicking 2 of his original blends. The clause allowed him to claim brand dilution, and she was forced to remove the items and pay a settlement. What could have turned into a brutal lawsuit got handled quietly and fairly, because they had prepared for the possibility. Story 29. I worked with a couple who were both musicians. He was in a touring rock band she composed for film. The prenup had a very niche but clever clause known as the Stage Silence Clause. It stated that neither party could publicly disparage the other in song lyrics, album titles, or live performances for profit after a divorce. If violated, all proceeds from the offending piece of media would be transferred to the other party. It sounded like a joke, but they were serious. "No diss tracks," she said during negotiation. "No Taylor Swifting me." When they eventually split, he released an EP that included a track with very thinly veiled references to her, including the name of her dog and a lyric about betrayal. She sued. A forensic lyric analyst, yes, that's a real job in music disputes, proved it was unmistakably about her. The judge awarded her 100% of the streaming revenue from the song and ordered the label to pull it from platforms. That's when I learned, in the world of art, clauses don't just protect wallets, they protect dignity. Story 30. I once handled a prenup between a Silicon Valley investor and a brilliant woman who had zero interest in his wealth. What she did want was a sense of permanence, not in marriage, but in legacy. Her lawyer drafted a philanthropic future clause. It stated that if they ever divorced, both parties had to contribute 10% of their divorce settlements to a joint philanthropic fund supporting a cause they'd both agreed on during the marriage. The fund would be publicly named and required both their signatures for allocation decisions. She believed that if their love didn't last, at least their shared values should. When they did eventually split after 8 years, the fund clause kicked in. They each donated a massive sum and created a scholarship program for underprivileged girls in STEM. Neither of them wanted to be involved with each other anymore, but both were deeply proud of the impact. The clause didn't protect assets. It protected purpose. And in a sea of greedy divorces, it was one of the most human, forward-thinking legal agreements I've seen. Story 31. I represented a woman who was marrying a retired professional poker player. He was charming, extremely wealthy, and well-connected in the gambling world. But her attorney had seen enough in her past to suggest what became known as the high-stakes clause. It stated that if her husband ever gambled more than $10,000 in a single day using joint marital funds or accounts without prior written consent, he would forfeit 25% of his claim to any joint assets during a divorce. At first, the groom laughed it off, said he was done with that world. He signed it, no problem. 2 years later, she found bank withdrawals totaling $75,000 over a weekend in Vegas. He claimed it was networking, but surveillance and ATM records proved he hit the high roller tables again. When divorce hit shortly after, the clause cut his share of their assets by nearly a quarter. He tried to argue it was play money, but the contract didn't care about intentions, only thresholds. It was a preemptive strike against backsliding, and it worked perfectly. Story 32. This couple were both professors, one in philosophy, the other in economics. Their prenup contained an unorthodox but wildly clever clause we called the sabbatical provision. It stated that if either party took a sabbatical from work for more than 6 months for personal development, the other party would match that time with unpaid household labor or support. Why? Because she feared he'd retire into self-actualization while she carried the domestic load. And she was right. 5 years in, he announced he was taking a year to write a book and meditate in Bhutan. She reminded him of the clause. He said it was spiritually irrelevant. In the divorce that followed, the clause allowed her to claim monetary credit for the domestic responsibilities she picked up during that time, including home maintenance, elderly parent care, and child transportation, all itemized and valued by a mediator. He ended up owing her nearly $80,000 worth of equivalent labor in the settlement. Philosophy met economics and lost. Story 33. One of my more surreal cases involved a couple who were both social media influencers. The clause the wife insisted on was dubbed the Digital Dead Zone Clause. It required that if they ever broke up, both parties were prohibited from posting, hinting, or subtweeting about the relationship for 12 months post-divorce. Violations would result in a $10,000 penalty per post. Why? Because she'd been burned before. An ex made her life hell online after their breakup. They both agreed, believing they'd never need it. But once their content partnership started crumbling, things got ugly. He posted vague memes, emotional growth captions, even a kyanda, where he referenced being betrayed. That alone triggered 4 violations. She lawyered up, took screenshots, submitted time-stamped posts, and enforced the clause. He paid $40,000 in total and eventually deleted every trace. Influencers may live online, but this clause reminded them that contracts matter more than clout. Story 34. A musician and a novelist were getting married. The musician's lawyer introduced a clause that became known as the inspirational source disclaimer. It said that if either party ever used the other's life story, quotes, or personal trauma in their professional creative work, they must either 1. Anonymize it beyond recognition, or 2. Share 50% of any revenue earned from the project. Sounds odd, but they both drew inspiration from real life. It wasn't an issue. until she published a memoir-style novel featuring a character with her husband's exact addiction history, his unique tattoo, and even their pet's name. The book went semi-viral. He sued. The clause held. Since she hadn't anonymized the details adequately, she owed him half of the book's royalties and advance. What stunned her most? He didn't care about the money. "I just wanted the right to say, that's my story too." Story 35. A woman who worked in biotech married a man who owned a chain of gyms. She was brilliant, analytical, and detail-obsessed. Her prenup request was dubbed the Family Lobbying Clause. It stated that if either party's family attempted to interfere in financial matters, investments, real estate, business decisions, and that interference led to measurable loss, the offending party's settlement would be reduced by 20%. Her reasoning? His parents were very involved in his business. She wanted a buffer between their marriage and the in-laws' unsolicited advice. Sure enough, 3 years in, his father convinced him to invest $300,000 into a fitness product that tanked within 6 months. Her husband admitted his dad had pushed the idea, and he didn't want to disrespect him. When they separated, the clause allowed her team to deduct the entire loss directly from his marital share. It wasn't about punishing him. It was about making sure marriage meant 2 voices, not 3. Story 36. A woman marrying a former child actor turned entrepreneur included what we jokingly called the fade-out clause. It stated that if either spouse's public reputation dropped below a specified brand threshold, defined by social media engagement, income from appearances, or professional standing, the other would be entitled to renegotiate spousal terms. At first, it sounded like something out of a Black Mirror episode. But she'd spent years building her reputation as a self-made businesswoman, and she didn't want his scandals to drag her down. A few years in, he had a very public breakdown involving an altercation at a film festival and a leaked video. Her sponsorship deals were threatened just by association. She didn't want a divorce yet, but she did invoke the clause. They entered arbitration, and her portion of joint marketing ventures and IP was reassessed to reduce her risk exposure. What stunned me was how strategic it was. Not about love, not about trust. It was brand risk management written into marriage. Story 37. This one involved 2 environmental scientists who got married after collaborating on several large-scale climate reports. Their prenup included a credit continuity clause. If one spouse ever contributed to research, editing, or writing that appeared in the other's published work, they must be credited as co-author or research contributor, or be paid a percentage of any grant or publication royalties. It came from a place of mutual respect, but also realism. They knew co-authorship disputes could get nasty. 5 years later, the wife published a widely acclaimed report that won international awards. The husband quietly pointed out that he'd drafted a key chapter on marine heat waves, which had been published almost verbatim. She said it had been revised enough not to require credit. The clause said otherwise. He was added post-publication as co-contributor and received 20% of the prize stipend. No drama, no media leaks, just a prenup doing exactly what it was built to do. Story 38. A famous fitness influencer with millions of followers got engaged to a guy who was, for lack of a better word, a fan. Her lawyer created a clause that became known in our firm as the parasite prevention provision. It stated that if the spouse gained more than 500,000 social media followers or signed a monetized brand deal using the influencer's name, likeness, or image during the marriage, 60% of those earnings would be considered marital and subject to her control in divorce proceedings. People said it sounded narcissistic. She called it protection. Within a year of marriage, her husband launched a couples coaching brand using their shared workouts and got a blue check. When she discovered he'd been privately negotiating ad deals with her image plastered across the landing pages, she immediately filed. The prenup allowed her to freeze all revenue streams tied to their likeness and pull him from the market. The clause prevented him from profiting off her name without consent and probably saved her millions in brand damage. Story 39. This case involved a tech couple, both in AI development, both brilliant, and both competitive. The prenup featured a mutual NDA clause, which stated that in the event of divorce, neither party could disclose or reference any of their joint projects, internal work processes, or experimental code created during the marriage. They weren't working at the same company, but they constantly shared ideas over dinner. It was part of the relationship. Flash forward 4 years. They split. She got recruited by a major competitor of his employer, and suddenly he started warning colleagues that she knew too much. She reminded him of the clause. When he tried to leak emails showing what she'd helped him brainstorm for his startup, she sued. The court ruled that even conversations over wine counted as protected under the clause. He had to pay damages and issue a formal retraction. That clause wasn't just a prenup. It was industrial espionage prevention. Story 40. A woman who was heir to a prestigious wine estate married a young sommelier from Italy. Her lawyer added an elegant but forceful vintage respect clause. It said, if any wine from her family's personal reserve was opened, sold, or shared without her explicit consent, the violating party would forfeit their inheritance claim and asset share tied to the vineyard. The groom agreed, thinking it was just a formality. But 5 years later, after a rocky patch in their marriage, he hosted a lavish dinner party while she was out of town and served a 1947 vintage Bordeaux worth over $40,000. Multiple bottles. She found out when guests posted photos on Instagram. When divorce followed months later, the clause triggered. He was cut out of the vineyard's valuation entirely, nearly $2.3 million in holdings, and even lost access to joint shares that were tied to the estate. He cried in court, saying it was just wine, but to her, it was family legacy, and it had a price. Story 41. A billionaire venture capitalist was marrying a woman who ran a small local art gallery. Her lawyer added what became known as the founder fatigue clause. It stated that if the husband created or backed more than 3 startups within a single calendar year without prior notice and approval, she would receive a compensation bonus, paid quarterly based on the total valuation of those startups. At first, he didn't even blink. He was used to launching ventures at a breakneck pace. But this clause was her way of avoiding being stuck in a marriage with someone who'd mentally checked out. 3 years in, he founded 5 startups in 6 months and hadn't told her about 3 of them. She triggered the clause. An arbitrator calculated that her payout from just 2 of those companies was $1.1 million. It wasn't revenge. It was balance. She'd supported him through insane hours, ignored vacations, and lonely nights. That clause made sure her emotional labor had financial weight. Story 42. This couple had been together for nearly a decade before marrying. She was a playwright. He was a theater actor. Their prenup included the stage rights reversal clause. It stated that if either party was ever cast in a major production written by the other, the writer would retain full artistic control and 70% of ticket and licensing profits related to that work, regardless of marital status. To most people, it seemed like overkill. But they'd had creative fights before. He wanted to reinterpret her characters. She wanted control over her narratives. Years later, she wrote a semi-autobiographical play that got picked up off Broadway. He was cast as the lead without her knowledge, thinking it was a romantic gesture. She was furious, but calm. She triggered the clause, demanded licensing control, and ultimately replaced him with another actor. He threatened to sue. The court upheld the prenup and cited artistic autonomy. That clause didn't just preserve the integrity of the work. It preserved her dignity. Story 43. A software engineer married a freelance journalist who had built her name through hard-hitting political investigations. Her team requested the whistleblower wall clause. It guaranteed that if she ever published a story involving a company or entity tied to his financial portfolio, she would retain complete journalistic independence and immunity from asset-based retaliation and divorce. It was basically a legal shield in case her reporting disrupted their shared finances. Most assumed the clause would never be relevant, until she exposed unethical AI practices in a firm he had invested in through a blind venture fund. The fallout was brutal. His partners blamed her. His net worth took a hit. He filed for divorce 2 months later, citing irreconcilable differences. But the clause held. She retained full journalistic rights and was protected from any claims of sabotage or spousal financial harm. When journalism meets marriage, protection goes both ways. Story 44. A world-renowned pastry chef was marrying someone who'd once worked in her kitchen as an assistant. Her lawyer added a clause that became legendary in our office. The recipe secrecy clause. It stated that if her spouse ever revealed, taught, or attempted to reproduce any of her unpublished recipes, whether in a restaurant, online, or private culinary event, they would owe her $250,000 per violation, and waive all rights to any culinary-related income for 5 years. After the marriage fell apart, he opened a boutique dessert shop under his own name. One of the first offerings? A lavender citrus mousse tart that looked exactly like one she'd only served at private events. She sent a cease and desist and hired an expert to analyze the tart. A single ingredient match wasn't enough. She had the exact plating photos from her archives to prove its origin. The clause triggered. He owed $500,000 in damages and had to shut the business down. The culinary world is sweet until it gets personal. Story 45. A tech executive married a woman who was a rising star in digital animation. Her creations were starting to gain traction online, and her lawyer included a creative burn clause. It said that if her husband ever used his tech influence or resources to block, deplatform, or interfere with the distribution of her art, she would receive ownership of all joint real estate acquired during the marriage. Most laughed at it. He claimed he'd never be that petty. But 5 years later, a dispute over a particularly dark short film, inspired by their relationship, led him to contact a platform he had ties with, asking them to demonetize and shadow ban her content. She found out fast. Emails leaked. She filed for divorce and enforced the clause. He tried to argue it wasn't real interference, just a misunderstanding. The arbitrator disagreed. She walked away with full title to 2 houses and a vacation property. The clause wasn't about money. It was about the right to speak, even through animation. Story 46. A woman marrying a commercial airline pilot requested what she coined the flight delay clause. It stated that if her spouse missed more than 15 major family events, anniversaries, birthdays, holidays, or planned vacations within any 3-year period due to avoidable scheduling choices, she would be entitled to an automatic bonus equivalent to 10% of their joint liquid assets upon divorce. Why? Because she had grown up with a father who constantly missed milestones, and she wasn't going to relive that disappointment. Her fiancé pushed back, said it wasn't his fault when flights changed. But her team wrote the clause carefully. Avoidable was defined as trips he volunteered for, traded into, or failed to dispute. Sure enough, by year 4, he had missed 19 events, 5 of which he'd picked up for double pay. She filed for divorce and used the clause. He tried to fight it, but the digital logs and texts didn't lie. She walked away with an additional $240,000. He called it harsh. She called it accountability. Story 47. An Olympic swimmer was marrying a pharmaceutical rep, and their dynamic was intense, driven, ambitious, but constantly in motion. Her attorney added a clause called the peak performance clause. It stated that if the husband sabotaged or interfered with any of her training, competitions, or sponsorships, either by direct disruption or emotional manipulation, he would owe her a lump sum payout indexed to her lost earnings potential. It was highly specific. Emotional interference included public drama, travel plan changes, or press leaks within 60 days of competition. 2 years in, after a fight, he accidentally leaked an early draft of a controversial sponsorship she was negotiating with a high-end alcohol brand, causing the sponsor to walk away. She had emails showing he sent it to a journalist. The clause activated. They divorced, and an independent agency valued the lost deal at $380,000. He paid the full amount. His explanation? I was mad. Her lawyer said, then you just paid for your tantrum. Story 48. A woman who owned a chain of vintage bookstores married a real estate investor with a flair for flipping historic buildings. She insisted on what her lawyer called the Preservation Principle Clause. It stated that if her husband sold or materially altered any shared property with historic significance without her written approval, she'd receive exclusive rights to retain or restore another of equal value from the portfolio. He found it romantic. She found it essential. 2 years later, without telling her, he gutted a 1920s stone home they co-owned, turning it into a sleek Airbnb with 0 character. She found out via listing photos. She triggered the clause, and the arbitrator ruled in her favor. She selected another property of similar worth from their joint holdings and converted it into a rare books residency and community library. He lost one of his most valuable buildings because he didn't ask before tearing out stained glass windows. The lesson? Style matters, but so does permission.